In this video, we're going to be focusing on Unreal Engine 5 games now that we have more out here. And I'm not just going to be looking at just ultra settings, native resolution. We're going to be looking at high settings as well as ultra, as well as using DLSS and FSR, including frame generation when available. And I'll talk more about all of that in the detailed head-to-head benchmark section, which we'll get to in just a second. But why are we talking about Unreal Engine 5 and why are we talking about these two particular GPUs? So first of all, Unreal Engine 5 is going to be used by a huge number of upcoming new games. Unreal Engine has always been popular, and it's looking like Unreal Engine 5 maybe even more so. For better or for worse, whether you like the engine or not, a lot of major developers, including ones who used to use their own custom engines like CD Projekt, who makes the Witcher games, and Cyberpunk, has said that their upcoming titles, next Witcher game, that's an Unreal Engine 5 game. So this is performance in this engine is very important. And so I'm interested in how these GPUs do perform. Also, haven't I already done head-to-head comparisons of these GPUs, including against other GPUs? Well, yes, I did a 7800 XT versus 4070 head-to-head, although in that one I also included the 6950 XT, but it wasn't just Unreal Engine 5 games, it was some of the latest games. Some of those were Unreal Engine 5, but this is focusing on Unreal Engine 5 exclusively. And then also, pricing has changed since I've done head-to-head comparisons. The 7800 XT launched at $500 and has been available at that price, although currently the cheapest models available in the US are about $520. $500 models do still come in stock pretty regularly. The model I'm using in this particular video is the Power Color Red Devil OC, which is currently available at about $560. So not one of the cheapest cooler models available, but also not the most expensive. And we're up against the 4070. 4070s launched at a $600 MSRP, but are currently available as low as $540. I have seen them on sale as low as $520, especially when we saw Black Friday deals and things like that. And most models are available around, at least most manufacturers have at least one model available at $550. So these GPUs are actually very, very similarly priced in the current market, although the cheapest models do still tend to have a bit of an edge for the 7800 XT being a bit cheaper. But again, much more closer than at launch when it was $500 versus $600, $100 gap for the 4070 being more expensive. Also, competing products like the 6950 XT are kind of drying up at lower pricing. There are still some 6950 XTs available. Looks like you get, but $630. That's $100 more expensive now compared to what we're seeing here. So I'm going to focus more exclusively on these current gen GPUs as the previous gen dries up. If you're curious about my 4070 I'm testing in this video, it is the Founders Edition model from NVIDIA, and both the GPUs are being ran at their out-of-the-box settings. Let's go ahead and hop into the benchmarks, and there's a lot of them given all the different test settings that I'm using, and then we'll get into some final thoughts at the end of the video. We'll start our testing with Lords of the Fallen, which is one of the most demanding Unreal Engine 5 games and leverages the big features. Here, we're seeing that the 4070 and the 7800 XT are good for over 60 frames per second average, but not much over it, and this is at 1080p resolution, albeit at the game's ultra settings. So this is a very demanding game, and it does look like it takes this class of hardware to get us over 60 FPS. Now it's looking like the 4070 is slightly ahead, averaging 65 versus 62, giving it a 5% lead in the averages. Although if you look at the 1% lows as we turn this corner here, get a few more loading spike stutters on the 4070, and that puts the 7800 XT 3 FPS ahead for a 6% lead at 53 versus 50. But I think for a lot of people, that's not going to be quite the frame rate you're looking for. So if you reduce to high settings, which does kind of feel bad on this class of GPU at 1080p resolution, but if you do go down to high settings, this game still looks great. And now we're seeing an average of 88 FPS for the 4070 and 86 for the 7800 XT. So they are still absolutely neck and neck, giving a 2% lead to the 4070. If you take a look at the 1% lows, now they're both over 60 FPS even in the 1% lows. It's 65 versus 68, which is giving a 5% lead to the 7800 XT. So once again, small lead in the averages for the 4070, small lead in the 1% lows for the 7800 XT. I would mostly call it a tie. But what about 1440p resolution? I think this is where most people would be if they're buying this class of GPU, although a lot of people could still be using it for high refresh rate 1080p, so definitely still wanted to test that. But at 1440p, these are not going to be 60 frames per second GPUs if you want to crank all the settings up, in every game at least. Lords of the Fallen is dropping into the mid-40s on both of them. So 1440p ultra settings, 46 FPS average on the 4070 and 45 on the 7800 XT, so basically a tie in the averages, 2% lead for the 4070. 1% lows are also basically a tie at 38 versus 39, although this time the 3% lead, or 1 FPS advantage, goes in the direction of the 7800 XT. But again, I don't think that's the frame rate most people are looking for on this class of hardware. So one way to boost performance would be to upscale. I didn't look at that at 1080p, because honestly it looks worse at 1080p, and especially on this class of hardware, I think reducing settings made a lot more sense. And we will look at the high settings here, but first let's look at upscaling. So DLSS and FSR, the quality setting at 1440p, can often look quite good. And this does boost performance considerably in this game, getting us to 73 FPS average on the 4070 and 68 on the 7800 XT, with 1% lows, and actually an advantage for the AMD GPU at 51 versus 56. Although most of the benchmark run, they're pretty much even in the 1% lows. It's as we kind of turn this corner where there's some loading stutters that seem to hit the 4070 a bit harder. However, image quality-wise, I would say DLSS looked better there. If you don't want to use upscaling, you could instead reduce down to the high settings, and this does pull both GPUs over a 60 FPS average, but notice that staying at Ultra and using upscaling at the quality preset did give a larger performance boost than what we're seeing by going down to the high preset. Here we're seeing both GPUs now absolutely tied at 64 FPS in the averages. The 1% lows are basically a tie at 50 versus 53 by the end of this run, giving a 6% advantage to the 7800 XT. So again, you'd have to think about what would you rather do, drop down to high or use upscaling, or you could use both, although I did not test that here. Now there's no frame generation available in this game from either brand. The developers said that it was having crashing issues at launch, so they disabled it. Let's go ahead and look at 4K resolution. It's not out of the question to try GPUs like this at 4K, although we can see here that if you're trying to use them at ultra settings in the heaviest Unreal Engine 5 games, you're probably going to be a bit disappointed with the results, and we are in the mid 20 FPS range, so these are not the settings you're looking for. It's 25 FPS on the 4070 and 24 on the 7800 XT, which is a 4% lead for the 4070, but I think, we'd call it basically a tie. The 1% lows are all also basically tied. It is a 1 FPS difference, which does amount to 5% at this low of a frame rate, so 22 versus 21. And this time the 1% low advantage goes in the direction of the 4070. But again, those were probably not the settings we were looking for. Now, if you reduce down to high settings, you now will average over 30 FPS. Still probably not quite the performance target you'd be looking for, but it would at least enable, a 4K native at good settings with like a 30 FPS lock kind of a game. Here we're seeing 35 FPS average for both GPUs, so they're absolutely tied in the averages. And this time they are completely tied in the 1% lows, which sit at 30 frames per second. So once again, this kind of looks good for a 30 FPS lock type of a setup, but I doubt that's the way that most PC gamers would choose to go on it. But anyway, it's an interesting result, but I think we would prefer to use some kind of upscaling perhaps. And interestingly, if we stay at the Ultra preset, but enable upscaling, We can go all the way to 60 frames per second. Well, basically, here we're now at 59 FPS on the 4070 and 57 FPS on the 7800 XT. That gives it a 4% advantage, which is 2 frames per second to the 4070. And in the 1% lows, the 7800 XT has a 1 FPS advantage, and it's a 2% advantage, if you want to look at it that way, for the 7800 XT. Again, the image quality differences, though, I would say when you're using upscaling, the image quality advantage goes to the 4070. So while performance is a tie, image quality, I would say, is a win for the NVIDIA GPU. But what about the Talos Principle 2? Let's check out some other games. At 1080p ultra settings, now we're actually seeing AMD with a more noticeable lead here. The 7800 XT is winning by 10%, or 102 versus 93 FPS on the averages. And in the 1% lows, it's winning by an even larger 17% at 76 versus 65. Now, I will mention that this is just testing the very opening area of the game, and later areas can be more difficult to run. So even though these are high frame rates, do keep that in mind. And you can push the frame rates even higher if you need to by dropping down to high settings at 1080p. Here we're seeing a 13% lead for the 7800 XT in the averages at 144 FPS versus 128. And in the 1% lows, again, we're seeing an even slightly larger advantage for the 7800 XT at a 17% lead. It's 102 FPS versus 87 on the 4070. So here we're definitely seeing larger advantages for the 7800 XT here than what we saw in Lords of the Fallen, and it'll be interesting to see if that continues as we change the resolution. Moving up to 1440p ultra settings, the overall advantage is reduced, but it's still more noticeable than what we were seeing in Lords of the Fallen. Here we're seeing where we were basically tied. And in this one, at 1440p Ultra, we're seeing both GPUs over 60 FPS, although, like I said, this is not one of the most demanding areas of the game. We're seeing 67 versus 62, which is an 8% lead for the 7800 XT. And the 1% lows are at 49 versus 45, which is a 9% lead for the 7800 XT. So not a mind-blowing advantage, but definitely more noticeable than what we were seeing in Lords of the Fallen. And if we wanted to run at higher frame rates, we could reduce down to the high preset. Here we're seeing a 9% lead again for the 7800 XT. That's in the averages at 96 versus 88. The 1% lows are a 10% advantage for the 7800 XT, and it's at 69 FPS versus 63 on the 4070. And the 7800 XT gets extra bonus points for hitting 69 FPS. And for the dyslexic people in the audience, it's the averages are 96 and the 1% lows are at 69. So all sorts of fun stuff there. But what if we wanted higher frame rates by upscaling? Here, once again, I've got to say image quality advantage for DLSS. We're looking at 1440p Ultra, DLSS, and FSR at the quality settings. Little things like the palm tree branches and the blades of grass do seem to be a little more fizzly looking on the FSR image quality. Overall, the performance numbers do put the 7800 XT ahead by 6% at 110 versus 104 on the averages, but the 1% lows are basically tied at 72 versus 71. And again, it's not exactly apples to apples image quality here, so do keep that in mind when you're looking at those results. What if we moved up to 4K resolution and started out at the Ultra preset? Well, both GPUs are going to struggle here. We're seeing over 30 FPS on the averages, but we're dropping below that in the 1% lows. It's a 34 to 33 FPS advantage for the 7800 XT on the averages, which gives it a 3% lead, so back to pretty much a tie. And the 7800 XT takes a 1 FPS advantage in the 1% lows as well at 27 versus 26, which does calculate out to a roughly 4% lead here. But not a massive difference, and I don't think this is how you would want to play the game on either GPU. So one option is to drop down to high settings. Dropping down to high settings, we see frame rates go up to around 50 FPS, the 7800 XT averaging 50, and the 4070 averaging 48. That gives it the 7800 XT a 4% lead in the averages at 4K high. The 1% lows are dropping into the upper 30s on both GPUs, this time giving a 1 FPS advantage to the 7800 XT at 39 versus 38. That is a 3% lead for the 7800 XT. Now, the game's totally playable at these settings, but I'm still not sure it's exactly what everybody would be looking for on this class of hardware. So another option to try out would be upscaling. And once again, we're seeing that upscaling can get a larger boost to performance than just, reducing down to high settings, although you take different kinds of image quality hits. And once again, we are seeing the image quality advantage, I would say, definitely going for DLSS. Again, fine details, palm tree branches, things, discluded objects, things like that, the grass. Not sure how well it'll come through on YouTube compression. But anyway, performance numbers, we're seeing 86 versus 78, so advantage to the 7800 XT by 10%. And in the 1% lows, 21%. But let's go ahead and switch over to Immortals of Aveum. This game will be interesting because unlike Talos Principle and Lords of the Fallen, which both disabled frame generation due to crashing issues when you look at their patch notes, Immortals of Aveum will allow us to test out frame generation, and it implements both DLSS and FSR3 frame generation, although currently that's turned off, and we're just looking at 1080p Ultra. At 1080p Ultra, we are seeing a 17% lead for the 7800 XT at 99 FPS versus 85, and a 30% lead in the 1% lows at 83 versus 64. This is the most noticeable advantage we've seen so far, and it goes advantage to the 7800 XT. And what about moving up to 1440p resolution? Now we're seeing a 21% advantage for the 7800 XT on the averages at 70 versus 58, and a 32% advantage in the 1% lows at 58 versus 44. I'm curious if these developers worked more closely with AMD due to the, this is one of the first two games that got FSR3 implementation, for example. Or maybe, this game is just running better on AMD hardware just due to how the game is. I don't know, but this is certainly a larger advantage than we were seeing in the other games. But what about that DLSS versus FSR? Here we're looking at just the upscaling when it says FG off versus the upscaling at quality plus frame generation, and it's DLSS on the 4070 and FSR3 on the 7800 XT. The relative performance numbers are without frame generation because I don't think generated frames really count as performance. Also note the frame time graph looks a bit weird with FSR3 frame generation enabled, and the frame pacing smooths out if you lock it to VSync in this game, which I didn't do here to show us the full performance numbers. With DLSS quality, no frame generation, we're seeing 100 FPS versus 88, which is a 14% advantage for the 7800 XT, and 85 versus 66 in the 1% lows, which is a 29% advantage for the 7800 XT. Image quality-wise, though, I would have given the advantage to the DLSS upscaling again. Immortals of Aveum at 4K Ultra is a very demanding thing to try to do. And the 4070 falls just shy of 30 FPS at 29 average. And the 7800 XT wins by 21%, but that only gets it to 35 FPS, so still probably not the settings that you're looking for here. And the 1% lows are even lower at 22 versus 28. That does give a 27% advantage to the 7800 XT. but still keeps it under 30 FPS in the 1% lows. So probably not the settings we'd be looking for. What about upscaling? Here we're looking once again at DLSS 3 versus FSR 3 with frame generation and without. The relative performance numbers are calculated without frame generation, since again, I really think of generated frames as more of a motion smoothing technology rather than a performance technology. So anyway, here we're seeing the 7800 XT winning by 11% in the averages with no frame generation at 78 versus 70. And we're seeing the 1% lows at 66 versus 54, which is a 22% advantage with 7800 XT. But again, I would say image quality-wise, I still do prefer the DLSS image. Let's jump over to RoboCop Rogue City at 1080p Ultra. Here we're seeing both GPUs doing well at 97 versus 89 FPS, and that does give a 9% lead to the 7800 XT. So not as dramatic of a lead as we were seeing in Immortals of Aveum. This is closer to what we were seeing in Talos Principle 2, for example. But not as neck and neck as we were seeing in something like Lords of the Fallen. The 1% lows are also giving a 9% lead to the 7800 XT, 77 versus 71. But what if we reduced down to the high settings? And I thought this was interesting because in the other games where we tested high settings, I didn't test it in Immortals of Aveum because there actually isn't really global presets. So Ultra, I was just maxing everything out. But anyway, this game has a high preset, and here it actually brings both GPUs' performance up, but it seems to benefit the 4070 more, bringing it in line to the performance of the 7800 XT, with them both tied now at 101 FPS, and the 1% lows at 81 versus 82, so 1% lead with 7800 XT, but not much to really note. So interesting that the high settings scale differently than the ultra settings. Back to ultra settings, but this time at 1440p, both GPUs are good for over 60 FPS, at least in this opening city scene area. And that's 61 FPS on the 4070 and 65 on the 7800 XT. That's a 7% lead for the 7800 XT. So again, ultra settings showing a bit of a lead for the AMD GPU. 1% lows are also a bit of a lead for the 7800 XT at 52 versus 55, which is about a 6% lead. So again, it will be interesting to see what happens when we turn down to the high settings. And once again, it seems like the high settings are more favorable to the NVIDIA GPU compared to what we were seeing at the ultra settings in this game. So just interesting how that's going on. Here we're seeing the 4070 actually take the lead by 3%. Now that's only 2 FPS, so I'd still basically call it a tie, but 70 versus 68 FPS on the averages. And the 4070 also has a lead in the 1% lows. This one a bit more noticeable at 60 versus 57, so 3 FPS, which is a 5% lead. So again, it's just very interesting to me how the high settings are scaling differently than the ultra settings do. But if we went back to the ultra settings and instead wanted to boost performance using upscaling, this time we only have frame generation available for the NVIDIA GPU, no FSR 3 in this game at this time. So that's putting the relative performance numbers here are definitely calculated without frame generation, but you can see the frame generated results on the right. Without frame generation, but with DLSS and FSR at the quality setting, we're seeing a 9% lead for the 7800 XT in performance at 97 versus 89, but image quality, again, I would have given advantage to DLSS. And at 4K Ultra, we're seeing around 30 FPS, so 33 versus 31. It's a 7% lead for the 7800 XT, and the 1% lows are a 29 versus 27 FPS advantage, so 7% lead for the 7800 XT there as well. Again, not really mind-blowing leads here, but we're back to seeing a bit of an advantage for the 7800 XT when we are at the Ultra preset. So again, we're at 4K resolution here, and 4K Ultra hitting around 30, probably not the performance most people are looking for. If we drop down to the high preset, we do gain some performance, but I've noticed that RoboCop isn't gaining as much performance going down to the high preset as our other games did. A lot of them had a more dramatic bump dropping from ultra to high. Here, dropping from ultra to high is getting us up to 37 FPS on the 4070 and 34 on the 7800 XT, which gives the 4070 a 9% lead now. So once again, we're seeing the swing go more advantage for NVIDIA when we drop to high settings in this game. And the 4070 has a 7% lead in the 1% lows at 33 versus 31. But if we stayed at the ultra settings, but instead went to use DLSS or FSR upscaling to boost performance, we can see by going all the way down to performance mode upscaling, we can considerably boost performance. We're at 68 versus 74, advantage performance-wise for 7800 XT. But again, on this performance mode upscaling, I really do see, in my opinion, a much better looking image from the DLSS upscaler, and again, also gives access to the frame generation, but it doesn't seem to be generating a lot of frames here. Anyway, in Jusant, we have 1080p Ultra averaging 106 FPS on the 7800 XT and 93 on the 4070. Although it should be noted that different areas and different views in this game can vary performance considerably. Our initial cave we were in was much lower, and then this area here with more open space much higher. Anyway, the 7800 XT has a 14% lead here in the averages and a 13% lead in the 1% lows at 72 versus 64. And if we go ahead and drop down to high settings here, I was curious if we would see something like we saw in RoboCop, where the high settings kind of brought things more favorable for the 4070, but that didn't happen here. Here, the 7800 XT at 1080p high is now averaging 149 versus 126 on the 4070, which is an 18% advantage. The 1% lows are a 19% advantage for the 7800 XT at 101 FPS versus 85 FPS. So back to pretty noticeable leads for the 7800 XT here, more in line with what we were seeing from like Immortals of Aveum, for example. And at 1440p at the Ultra preset, in that initial cave area, both GPUs were struggling a bit harder, and they can drop below 60 FPS. Although in these easier scenes, they're both well over 60 FPS, putting the average for this entire test at 68 for the 4070 versus 76 on the 7800 XT. That's giving it a 12% advantage, and the 1% lows are an 11% advantage for the 7800 XT at 51 versus 46. Now, what if we wanted to boost performance? One option is to drop down to high settings, and once again, like we saw at 1080p, the high settings in this game are not skewing in favor of the 4070. So it seems like that was kind of unique to RoboCop, at least from our testing so far. Here we're getting a 18% lead for the 7800 XT on the averages at 110 versus 93. And in the 1% lows, we're getting 73 versus 62, which calculates out to an 18% advantage for the 7800 XT. And they're both getting pretty good frame rates at those settings. But if you wanted to stay at the Ultra preset, you could boost performance using upscaling. Here we're looking at DLSS versus FSR, and once again, this game offers frame generation for DLSS, but not for FSR, so that's an option you could use. But interestingly here, you're not getting that massive of a frame rate boost on the frame generation. I mean, it is giving an advantage for sure, but if you look at it compared to the AMD numbers, it's not always massive, and the raw results are 21% advantage 7800 XT, and 30% in the 1% lows. So just kind of interesting to look at the comparison there. But at 4K Ultra, we're seeing an 8% advantage for the 7800 XT at 42 versus 39. The 1% lows and the more demanding scenes can even drop below 30 FPS. Here we're seeing 28 for the 7800 XT and 26 for the 4070. That's an 8% lead in the 1% lows as well. So both averages and 1% lows, 8% lead for the 7800 XT here. However, it's not looking like these would probably be the settings most people would want to play at. So what are our options? Once again, one option is dropping down to high, and we do get a nice performance boost here. Although more demanding scenes like that cave we started out in will certainly be below 60 FPS, and our 1% lows here are still down in the 30s. The 1% lows are 35 versus 38, giving a 9% advantage to the 7800 XT. And the averages are 57 versus 52, which is giving a 10% advantage to the 7800 XT. So overall, looking like advantage 7800 XT there. But what about using upscaling? So here I thought I'd actually try out staying at the high settings and then using upscaling at the quality setting at 4K, but also kicking on frame generation when available. And again, not getting such a massive frame rate boost from frame generation that at these settings, we're actually still seeing, if you compare the frame rate numbers, that the 7800 XT without frame generation is actually ahead of the frame generated numbers on the 4070. But comparing without frame generation, we're actually seeing a 21% lead on the 7800 XT in the averages and 26% in the 1% lows. Let's go ahead and take a look at Remnant 2 before we go. This game, to my knowledge, doesn't feature the lumen lighting system, but does feature nanite. At least that's how it was at launch, and I don't think it's been changed since then. And here at 1080p Ultra, we're seeing 103 FPS on the 7800 XT versus 89 on the 4070, which is a 16% advantage for the 7800 XT. The 1% lows are 86 versus 67, so that's actually a 28% advantage for the AMD GPU on the 1% lows. I won't be testing out high settings in this game because in other testing I've done, the high setting and ultra setting performs almost identically. I think at launch the ultra setting included a more demanding setting that they've removed since then, and since then they've become very, very similar. Here we're seeing 1440p Ultra results giving a 21% lead for the 7800 XT at 74 versus 61. And the 1% lows are a 24% lead for the 7800 XT, which is 63 versus 51. So again, one of the games that's showing a much more noticeable advantage for the 7800 XT. And what if we wanted to use upscaling to boost performance? So 1440p Ultra with DLSS and FSR at the quality preset. But again, this is a game that does feature frame generation for DLSS, but not for FSR. If we compare the numbers without frame generation, it's 99 versus 92, 8% advantage for 7800 XT. So the 4070 closing some of the gap when upscaling, but still a 14% advantage in the 1% lows. And, the frame generation does pull the frame rate number ahead on the 4070 if you're using it. But again, they're not directly comparable because, it's not, they're not responsive frames. It introduces its own image quality. And image quality-wise, though, I would still give advantage to DLSS upscaling versus FSR. Remnant 2 at 4K Ultra is a pretty demanding thing to try to do, but the 4070 is hitting 32 FPS, whereas the 7800 XT is hitting 41. That is a 28% lead. And the 1% lows are 28 versus 35, which is a 25% lead in the 1% lows. So it's looking like as our resolution increased here, we saw the performance lead for the 7800 XT increase as well. It's not VRAM related. Neither GPU is using all that much VRAM here. And if we try to use upscaling at the performance setting this time, staying at the Ultra preset, I would definitely say image quality advantage, especially like as things are disoccluded, as the character's arm swings, for example, and grass is revealed behind it, things like that. Little bits of image quality advantage, I would say, for DLSS here. And DLSS can use frame generation, but performance-wise, we're seeing the 7800 XT ahead at 81 versus 75 when we compare the non-generated frames. And the 1% lows are 69, nice, versus 62, 11% advantage to the 7800 XT. Let's get some final thoughts. Well, I thought this was really interesting. We saw that while in Lords of the Fallen, they were mostly tied and maybe even advantage 40-70. In the other 5 games, that was really not the case. If we scroll through here, pay attention to the percentage difference between the GPUs, and just kind of scroll through all of the results here quickly, you can see, again, Lords of the Fallen mostly tied, but a bit of an advantage 40-70 at all the various settings. But as soon as we jump to Talos Principle 2, usually advantage 7800 XT, sometimes by 10% or more, sometimes closer. Jumping into Immortals of Aveum, sometimes 20% advantages, sometimes in the teens, but usually more than a 10% lead. RoboCop Rogue City was interesting in that ultra settings tended to be a 8 to 10% lead for the 7800 XT, but tied at the high settings. Again, a bit of an advantage at the ultra settings for AMD, slight advantage, basically a tie for the 4070 at high settings. So that was a game where it was pretty interesting result like that. Again, scrolling through more of the games in Jusant, we generally saw 10% or sometimes even close to 20% or more lead for the 7800 XT. And, that applied to a lot of different quality settings. And jumping into games like Remnant 2, again, seeing often more than a 10% lead, sometimes even over a 20% lead for the 7800 XT. And I thought that that's very interesting because this is not exactly lining up with typical results when comparing these two GPUs. So, for example, if you look at something like TechSpot, this is the same benchmark data, I think, generated by the Hardware Unboxed YouTube channel, but they publish a text format version on TechSpot. So to be clear, this is not my testing. If we just look at, and by the way, I will link all my sources in the video description, so definitely take a look at this as another very detailed head-to-head on these GPUs, focusing on a wider variety of games. What I think is really interesting here is this. The 7800 XT versus the 4070, on average at 1440p in these games, gave a 7% advantage to the 7800 XT, and that is with ray tracing data excluded. I'll talk more about ray tracing in just a second, but you can see here that, as you test a wide number of games, some games skew towards NVIDIA, some games skew more towards AMD, and some games are more in the middle. And sometimes entire engines skew one more or the other, which was a big reason why I was doing this video. I was interested, due to the popularity of Unreal Engine with game developers, if Unreal Engine 5 seemed to skew one way or the other. And it seems like in these results, I was generally showing more than a 7% advantage for the 7800 XT, oftentimes in the teens or even occasionally into the 20s, but I would say more often 10% or a little bit into the teens seemed common. So with that in mind, it does seem like Unreal Engine 5 might be skewing more towards the 7800 XT architecturally than the 4070, which is interesting. Now, another thing that I find interesting in the data here is talking about ray tracing, because, again, TechSpot here was excluding ray tracing data. Now, I wasn't excluding ray tracing data specifically. I was testing out the maximum settings available in these games. But you'll notice I never said hardware RT on, because none of the 6 Unreal Engine 5 games that I tested here offered a hardware ray tracing setting. Now, to be clear, Lumen, the lighting system, the global illumination system in Unreal Engine 5, or at least that Unreal Engine 5 offers and that most of these games were using, I think all of them except for Remnant 2 uses it, is a type of ray tracing, but it, as far as I could tell, was using the software-based ray tracing version of Lumen. Now, this is interesting because Unreal Engine 5 does offer hardware-accelerated Lumen in its development tools, but none of these games seem to offer it in the normal graphic settings menus of the game, which I find in and of itself to be interesting. The hardware-accelerated Lumen does tend to give better accuracy in reflections and some of the lighting. So it would be interesting if that was offered, but it didn't seem to be offered. That seemed to be a trend here, and that could be another reason why we were seeing such an advantage for the 7800 XT here versus ray tracing titles. For example, in my previous video comparing these GPUs, when we looked at a game like Ratchet and Clank, for example, when you push all of its RT settings all the way up, we saw the RTX 4070 had taken over 50% lead versus the 7800 XT in this scene, which is very considerable. So that's certainly interesting, and I'm curious, as we see more Unreal Engine 5 games, if we'll see more of them offering the hardware-accelerated ray tracing version of Lumen, or if we'll continue to see that just kind of left out of the graphic settings. I would certainly prefer to have the option to turn it on, even if maybe they're focusing on consoles where performance reasons leave them to not offer it. But again, on the PC space, I would prefer to have the option, even if people choose not to use it for performance reasons. Anyway, so I thought that was an interesting thing to notice here. Another interesting thing to point out is the VRAM differences between the GPUs not seeming to be actually relevant in any of the Unreal Engine 5 games that I tested here. Because one of the differences between these GPUs is that the 4070 is a 12 gigabyte graphics card and the 7800 XT is a 16 gigabyte graphics card. But if you scroll through this data, I think the most VRAM hungry game that I tested was the Talos Principle 2, and even going up to 4K Ultra, even on the 16 gigabyte card, and sometimes I've noticed AMD tends to allocate more VRAM than NVIDIA does, but even on an AMD GPU that had 16 gigabytes available, it was only reported 10 gigabytes allocated and 9 gigabytes actually per process usage, which falls very comfortably into the window that the 4070 could offer. So if you're wondering, was the performance differences VRAM related here? I think the answer is absolutely not. There is absolutely no indication that having more than 12 gigabytes of VRAM would have been beneficial in any of these games. But the 7800 XT was just outperforming the 4070 in those tests that we were looking at. So anyway, I thought that's interesting. Now, I'm not saying no games use more than 12 gigabytes of VRAM, especially games that use ray tracing, interestingly enough. For example, when we're looking at this Ratchet and Clank result, the AMD GPUs here are actually allocating 14 gigabytes of VRAM and showing per process usage a little bit over 12, although the 4070 was outperforming them and hitting right up against its 12 gigabyte allocation, but it did only report a per process usage of about 10. So there's some indication that perhaps NVIDIA is more efficient with its VRAM usage, but either way, it didn't seem like in Unreal Engine 5, which is what we're investigating in this video, VRAM seemed to play into the results at all. So anyway, what about getting to my thoughts on the two GPUs in general? Well, one thought is this video was very Unreal Engine 5 focused, and the GPUs themselves are, useful in other things besides Unreal Engine 5 games. So the data we looked at here is interesting, but taking a more big picture look, like factoring in the results from my previous video, including heavy ray tracing workloads and things like that, along with, results from other reviewers, like what we saw here from TechSpot, showing a wide variety of games, showing the 7800 XT only 7% average, faster on average, and that's with ray tracing excluded. With ray tracing results included, they had the 7800 XT only 5% faster on average with their ray tracing results. And if you focus exclusively on ray tracing, the 4070 takes the lead. But again, by what amount depends a lot on the game. So when you're weighing the full picture of these GPUs and looking at their current pricing, the 4070, again, at $540 to $550 for a lot of the models versus the 7800 XT at 520, 530, 540, 550. It's not that big of a price gap. So if we look at just the Unreal Engine 5 results, it seems like your answer would probably be grab the 7800 XT, and it's going to be a very popular engine. But even then, do definitely factor in the feature set, because one thing that was very noticeable was that of the 6 Unreal Engine 5 games I tested here, 4 of them offered frame generation, but only 1 of them offered FSR 3 frame generation. So there, it certainly seems to be the case that DLSS 3 frame generation is more widely available in those other games. Also, we noticed that the Unreal Engine 5 seems to respond extremely well to upscaling. The performance boosts that were available from upscaling were massive, and a lot of developers that have released games on Unreal Engine 5 have basically said that the game's designed with playing with upscaling in mind. So with that being the case, I do think that image quality-wise, it can be hard to see in a YouTube video, but in small details, palm tree branches, grass, things like that, I do think DLSS holds up better. And again, you often then seem to be getting more frequently to have the ability to use the frame generation technology on the NVIDIA GPU. So there's a lot of things to consider when factoring these in. There's also, power consumption is a lot better on the NVIDIA GPU versus the AMD GPU here. So a lot to think about, but I'm hoping you guys found this video useful and or interesting. I think personally, I would often be buying these GPUs for playing at 1440p. And, playing at 1440p with, DLSS quality, it looks close enough to native that I'd probably be enabling it. And in a lot of games, although not all of them, I would turn on frame generation. And so if that's the case, I think I would often, in the actual settings I would play the game at, be getting a better result on the 4070 while consuming less power and it not costing that much more money. So that's definitely something to think about when making your decision, but it certainly looks like from a raw performance perspective, the 7800 XT does seem to be outperforming the 4070 in Unreal Engine 5 games, especially at just raw performance numbers, at least in the sample of 6 games that I've been able to test so far. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section which one you would buy. And I hope, also huge thank you to channel members and subscribers, channel members for funding the channel directly. If you'd like to do that, you can hit the join button down below and that helps me out tremendously. Huge thank you, but huge thank you to subscribers and viewers and everyone. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.